My name is Laura Parker. I am the costume shop manager and costume designer here at NC State. Welcome back to our How to Theater series. This is our series where our technicians and all of our backstage folks, our designers, get together and we share our knowledge of how to make theater with y'all. So this is a super exciting opportunity for us to really share what we do with the public. So thank you so much for being here. We have on chat today Adrienne McKenzie. She's going to be monitoring the Q&A in the chat. So if you have any questions as we're going through our webinar today, please be sure to pop them in the chat there and she will read them out loud to me and we will get those questions answered because I cannot multitask to save my life. This week here in the costume shop, we are going to be going over how to use our good old trusty sewing machines here. We're going to go over some basic sewing machine knowledge. We'll go over how to thread at least these particular machines. We'll go over what all these fancy buttons and knobs mean, and then we're going to go through some basic sewing seams and skills that will get you through most of your projects. And we'll go through stuff that'll get you through probably 85% of what you need. We're going to get started. Our sewing machine up so we can take a look at it. All right, so here in our costume shop, and in many costume shops kind of across the country, and this is a very, very popular model. We use the Bernina 1008s. Unfortunately, Bernina stopped making these this year. So I know Adrienne's rolling her eyes and making angsty faces behind her mask. And so, but yeah, these are fantastic machines. So if you're looking for a machine, if you're in the market for a machine, this is not a Bernina commercial, but the characteristics of this machine are really phenomenal because it is a good old-fashioned mechanical sewing machine. There are no computerized bits on it. There are no buttons. There's no computer chip to go haywire. And it's also mostly metal parts. So all the internal workings on these are primarily metal parts, which make them really, really sturdy and really, really easy to care for. And that's why we like using them in here. They're good little workhorses. So if you're in the market for a sewing machine and you're looking to purchase one, either used or new, used is fine, y'all. Used is great. Look for an older machine, frankly. Look for a machine that is going to have more metal parts than not. Your mid 60s to about mid 80s Singers and Kenmores, Pfaffs, Berninas. Those are all really, really good, sturdy little workhorse machines. They're going to get you through most of the things that you need. If you do purchase a used machine, bring it to your local machine shop, your local sewing shop, and have the technician there just give it a good cleaning, give it a good once over, do any repairs or maintenance that may need to be done. And honestly, those older machines will last you a lifetime with really, really good care and good use. So we use these little guys in here because they're really, really sturdy. So we're just going to take a little walk through our machine here and go over some of the features that you'll want to keep an eye out for. Kind of starting from the top, we've got these little rods. That's going to be where our thread is going to go. And then this little plate right here is going to be our stitch selection. And you can see we have a red column and a green column. If you look down here at the bottom, boop, boop, yay, scanning, scanning, scanning. This little knob here is going to indicate which column we're looking at. So we've got the red column and the green column. And then this little knob here is going to move and it's going to choose our stitches for us. For most of the work that we do here in the shop, we're going to have it set on this straight to zigzag stitch. So that's going to be like literally 98% of the work that we do on these machines is going to be with our standard stitch. The stitch above that is a blind hem stitch that is going to replicate some of the hand stitches that we did in here, I think on our first webinar week. So you can do a invisible hem on a garment very, very quickly and very, very easily. And the rest of these are kind of decorative stitches. We may use these occasionally. You do see a lot of use of these in things like heirloom sewing, smocking. If you're doing any sort of historic reconstruction, these stitches are used relatively frequently in that. Quilters tend to like using some of these fancy stitches as well. But in here, we're just going to be using these 2 stitches primarily. If we scroll down here to our first big knob here, this one is going to control our stitch width. So you can see over here, we've got a little funky zigzag line that starts very, very narrow and it widens as you go down. That's going to control the width of our stitch. So on this particular machine, when the knob is set all the way over to 0, that is going to do a standard straight stitch. And the majority of your projects are going to be sewn with a standard straight stitch. And then as you turn that knob over towards 5, that is going to increase the width of this stitch. So it turns into a zigzag. So that is what that does. And then the center part of this knob here, that's going to control the needle position. So you can see right now it is standing at 12 and 6, straight up and down. And that means that the needle is going to be positioned at the center of our presser foot. And we'll get over to the presser foot momentarily. If we click it over to our left, our needle is going to move to the left. If we click it over to the right, our needle is going to move over to the right. And that's what this little chart here means. Most of the time, we're going to want this set at our 12 and 6, so our needle is right in the center of our presser foot. Scrolling down the machine, this is our buttonhole function here on the Bernina 1008. Most domestic sewing machines are going to have some sort of a buttonhole function, a buttonhole stitch, or a buttonhole attachment. So this is how the buttonholes work on the Bernina. If we scroll down a little more, we do use this knob all the time. This is a super little important knob on our machine. And so if we twist this knob here, this is going to control the length of the stitch. So that big round knob at the top controlled the width. This is going to control how close the stitches are together. So when it's set down close to 0, you can see from our little chart here, our stitches are going to be teeny, 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 tiny and super, super close together. If we scroll all the way down to our 5, our stitches are going to be very widely spaced. And then about a 2.5 is going to be our medium, our just right, our little Goldilocks stitch length. And that's typically where we're going to be sewing. So that's that. The other thing that this little knob does is if we hold it up like this, and we have to keep it held up manually with our finger, if we hold it up like this, the machine is going to go in reverse. And that is going to be a pretty important thing for us as we move forward with our stitches. So we're going to want that. The last little knob down here, this is going to be, again, this is going to control our stitch selection from our red column to our green column. And then the center knob here is going to control what's called the feed dogs. And we'll get over to the feed dogs momentarily. We've got our manual knob here, so we can manually turn the needle up and down. And then on this particular machine, if you twist the center of this knob back, it's going to disengage the needle function so that you can wind the bobbin. So every machine is going to have something that's going to do that. That's where it is on this machine. Okay, if we scroll over down to our actual sewing mechanism here, you will notice that the machine is turned off. We don't ever want to touch or play with the sewing mechanism while the machine is on for risk that you will run over your finger. I have done it once. It hurts like heck. You don't want to do it. So when you're threading the machine, when you're changing out the needle, when you're changing out your presser foot, you want to make sure that your machine is turned off for safety purposes. So this is going to be where we are doing our sewing function. We've got our needle right here. This little friend right here, this is called our presser foot. And then down here, you can see these little kind of ridged pieces of metal here. These are the feed dogs. And so the way that the sewing machine works is there is a lever behind here, which you can't see, but you gotta trust me that it's there. And so this lever is going to lift and lower the presser foot so that it butts up right against those feed dogs. And as the machine goes, once you press on the pedal and you start going, you can see that those feed dogs are going, they're dropping into the machine and then they are raising back up. And so the pressure between the presser foot and the feed dogs there is what actually propels the fabric to move forward through the machine. So as we're sewing, we are not actually pushing the fabric through the machine. We're letting the pressure between the presser foot and the feed dogs move that fabric through for us. We're just going to guide the fabric through. On a very rare occasion, you may want to drop the feed dogs so that they don't engage. And you see this a lot with more art sewers, art quilters, and that sort of thing. They're going to manually propel the fabric through the machine on their own. They don't want to engage those feed dogs. But for most of what we do here in the costume shop, we're going to want those feed dogs engaged so that the fabric is propelling through the machine on a steady and consistent basis. So that's kind of how a sewing machine works. Then there's this little door down here, and if you open that up, we have our bobbin and our bobbin casing. You can see there's a little lever. I'm trying to see the best way to show this without getting my fingers in the way. It's a little lever right here, and you're going to pull on that to pull our little bobbin casing out. And then you're going to flip it over, and there's a teeny tiny little spool of thread. Oops, sorry, Adrian. There we go. Teeny tiny little spool of thread. This is called the bobbin. They look different on different machines. These metal ones are pretty kind of classic style bobbins. Some of the more modern sewing machines have plastic bobbins. You're always going to want to make sure that when you are purchasing replacement bobbins, you're purchasing the bobbin that is going to fit your machine, because they do come in different sizes and different shapes, and the machine is not going to work well if you're using a bobbin that is not made for it. So the way that a sewing machine functions is that the top thread and the bobbin thread are weaving together in like this weird little interlocking stitch. So you actually have two pieces of thread weaving on the top and the bottom of the fabric to join that fabric together. So that's why we need both our top thread and our bobbin thread. So that is going to be the function of the sewing machine. That's going to be our little guided tour of the machine. So we are going to move on to threading the sewing machine. So we're going to start with our top thread here. And I'm going to be using this bright red thread as we are working through our projects today. We do this in our classes when students are learning how to use the machine, so they can see very clearly where the thread is going and how the stitches and how the seams are working. If you were sewing an actual project, if you're putting together a costume or a piece of clothing or a quilt or whatever, you're going to choose the thread that matches your project so that the thread looks invisible, unless you want it visible. Sometimes you'll choose a contrasting thread. But here we're going to be using this red thread for all of our projects so we can see exactly what we're doing. So for these machines, and kind of the threading function works very similarly on most machines. You'll want to read your manual to see exactly how it works. but most of them are going to work in a relatively similar way. We're going to put our thread up here on the closest rod. And then we're going to run the thread through the machine in a zigzag pattern. So on the Berninas, we've got this little metal plate here. We're going to pull that forward there, run it through this channel. We're going to engage the needle so that this bar is all the way up at the top. From here, we're going to go around this piece of metal here and pull straight up. And there's really no way to show it, so you're going to have to trust me on this. But there is a little spring on the inside of this particular little piece of metal. And that's going to be acting as a tension to hold the thread in place and make sure that it goes through the machine on a consistent basis. So once we're down at the bottom of this Z, we're going to go up to this little top rod and go from left to right. There's a little metal plate there, and we're going to pull that down. So now we can see that the thread is creating this Z pattern on the front of our machine. And from here, we can kind of tug on the thread and we can feel the tension in the thread. It's just kind of bouncing a little. It's not going to be loose. It's going to feel fairly tight and sturdy there. So once we've got our machine threaded through this little Z pattern, on most machines, there's going to be a hook up here at the top of the needle. And so we're going to engage the thread through that hook. And all that hook is doing is just ensuring that the thread is running straight down the front of the machine and it's running straight down the front of the needle. So it's keeping everything in line there. And from here, I'm just going to drop our presser foot so that I can thread the needle a little more easily. And on these machines, on most home domestic machines, we're going to thread the needle from front to back. And I'm going to get in front of the machine to do this because I am blind as a bat and I can't see the hole for the needle without getting my face up in it. Excuse me for just a moment. And if the thread is a little frayed, like this one, just go ahead and snip it to get a nice clean edge on the thread, and that's going to make it a little easier to thread. There we go. All right, so once our needle is threaded, then we're going to lift up the presser foot, and on most presser feet, there's going to be a little notch or a little divot on the side, and we're going to run the thread underneath that divot. So now our thread lives underneath the presser foot, but above the feed dogs. And that's exactly where we want it to live. And from here, we're just going to pull on this a little bit. We're going to give ourselves a nice long tail, and we're going to let that tail kind of trail off the back of the machine. So now we're halfway done. The other thing we have to do is we have to put our bobbin in. And so we have our little teeny tiny spool of thread on our bobbin, and we're going to put it inside of our little bobbin casing here. And some machines have the bobbin casing kind of integrated into the machine, so you just drop the bobbin in. Older style machines are going to have these removable bobbin cases. So we're going to drop the bobbin into that bobbin casing like that. And on these, you can see there's a little metal plate here with a little divot here on the side. And so we're going to run the thread through that divot so it goes up under that metal plate and comes out the top like that. And that's just giving our bobbin a little bit of tension. We want it to keep that tension. So now we're going to flip it around. And on these machines, as long as our needle is fully engaged up at its highest point, that means that this top rod is going to go into the 12 o'clock position when we put the bobbin casing back in place. And you can see there is a little center rod right here that we're going to thread this bobbin onto. So all we're going to do is we're going to thread the bobbin onto that rod. We're going to position that top rod so that it is standing up at about 12 o'clock. And then we're going to press this into place. And when we press it in place, we're going to wait in here for a click. That's going to tell us that the bobbin is engaged, like that. So now we know that our bobbin is engaged, but now we have this thread just kind of hanging out here out of the front of our machine. And that's not going to do anything for us. So the last thing that we need to do is we need to tell our top thread to reach down, grab the bobbin thread, and pull it back up so that they are friends and they're working together to sew our garment. So on these machines, the one thing I don't like about these particular machines is that it does tend to kind of suck the thread back up into the mechanisms if you don't leave a long tail. And also when I engage the bobbin, I like to hold on to that thread just to make sure that it's not going to go anywhere. So I'm going to see if I can do this without getting my hands in the way. So we're going to hold onto that top thread. We're going to take our manual turn wheel here, and on these, we're going to turn it towards us one full rotation, and it's going to lift that bobbin thread up. So now, and then we can either sweep with our fingers, sweep with scissors, whatever you've got going there. Again, make sure that your machine is off when you are threading the machine. You don't want to accidentally engage the machine, run over your finger. So now we have our bobbin thread and our top thread living in harmony underneath our presser foot here. So that is threading our machine. So we're going to close up our little bobbin casing, and we have got our machine completely threaded. So now we can go ahead and move forward with actually sewing.
We have a question.
Yes.
Does it matter which direction the thread goes on the spool of the bobbin?
It does, and your manual is going to tell you that. It differs on different machines. On the Berninas, or at least on this model of the Bernina, it likes to go so that it is running over the top towards the left, so that it looks like the way that you're supposed to put the toilet paper on the toilet paper roll. Not the backwards way, but the right way. Look at the patent. But your manual is going to tell you which way it wants to go. It does differ clockwise or counterclockwise depending on brand. All right, so from here, we've got our machine threaded, and we are ready to move on to actually doing some sewing. So the first thing I want to show y'all how to do is how to basically just operate the sewing machine, how to let the fabric move through it cleanly and efficiently with yeah, sorry, my brain just went bloop. So what we're going to do, this is a project that we have our Stagecraft students do quite a bit. We're going to sew a square and we are going to sew a squiggle. And what these two little projects allow us to do is they teach us how to sew in a straight line, and they teach us how to sew on a curved line and how to work corners. If you can master those three skills, you can put together almost any project. That's going to be the majority of the sewing that we do in here. It's going to be straight lines, corners, and curves. And so I'm going to rotate the machine towards me now. Hopefully Adrian can get in here and so we can see exactly what we're doing. We're going to go ahead and start with our square because that's going to be the easiest place to start. So now I'm going to turn the machine on. You can see that light is engaged. That means that the machine is on. And so now I'm going to be really, really careful, and I'm not going to run my fingers underneath that presser foot, anywhere near that presser foot. We want to be really, really careful and cognizant about where our fingers are. It can be really easy to forget where your fingers are, especially if you've been working very, very long days. So on the center of most of these presser feet, there is going to be a line, and we're going to line, yeah, we can see that. I love this camera. We're going to position that little center line on our presser foot so that it is directly on our stitch line that we have traced out here. And if you remember way back at the beginning of this webinar, we talked about how the needle can move back and forth with that top knob. As long as that top knob is set at 6 o'clock and 12 o'clock, our needle is going to be directly in line with that center line on our presser foot. And so if we line our presser foot up with our stitch line, we're going to be able to sew exactly on that line. And so I'm going to position that and drop that presser foot so you can see kind of how this is, how it is lined up. And once that presser foot is dropped on these machines, I do recommend that folks use your manual turn wheel over here on the right side of the machine and turn that so your needle is dropped into the fabric. And that's going to engage the needle into the fabric. It's going to engage that bobbin thread, and it's going to give you a little bit of a cleaner head start with your sewing. And so the next thing that we need to do before we actually start moving along with our project is we need to tack the end of our thread down. So if you remember from our first webinar, we talked about tacking down the thread, starting off so your thread is engaged with the fabric. Here, we're going to start by pressing on our little foot pedal down here, and we are going to just go forward a couple of stitches, just a teeny tiny little bit. And now we're going to hold up our knob here over on the right so that the machine goes backwards just a few stitches. And that forward back motion is going to, basically that's going to act as our knot. That's going to make sure that the thread doesn't fall out after we've started sewing our project here. Some of the more modern machines, the computerized machines, actually have a knotting function on them, but all the older mechanical machines, you're going to need to do that backward and forward motion just to engage that thread to tack it down into your fabric. And then from here, we are just going to follow along. We're just going to follow along that line, and we're letting the fabric work its way through, being fed through by the feed dogs and the presser foot. We're not pushing our fabric as we sew. We're not holding it back. We're letting the machine actually move the fabric. And all we're doing is we're keeping our hands very, very clear of the needle. And we're just guiding the fabric through. So now we're almost at our corner here. So when we get to our corner, what we want to do is use our manual turn wheel over here on the right. And we're going to get as close to that corner as we can and drop that needle down into the fabric. And we're going to let it live down there. We want the needle to be all the way down, engaging that bobbin, going through the fabric. And now, once it's down there, we can lift that presser foot. You can see how the needle is down. Let me go down, move one more stitch. There we go. That's close to the corner. So we are down right in that corner, and all we have to do now to cut that corner really nicely and cleanly is pivot our fabric, and then we can drop that presser foot and continue on our merry way. And so we are going to sew our straight line. We're going to sew our straight line. Oh, look, we're outside a corner. We're going to get down into that fabric. We'll make sure that our needle is down. Lift that presser foot, turn, drop, and go. And we're going to do that all the way around our little square here until we get back to our starting point. Once we're back to our starting point, we're going to get down into that corner, and then we're going to lock our stitches again. So we've gone forward. Now we're going to raise this little knob here on the right, guide the fabric with our left hand, go back a little bit, and then we're going to go forward a little bit. And that action is going to lock our stitches. Before we pull the fabric out, we want to make sure that the needle is all the way up at the top, because that's going to finish our stitch. It's going to make sure that the bobbin thread is completely engaged, the top thread is completely engaged. And once we have our needle all the way up at the top, we can lift our presser foot, give that a gentle tug, and go ahead and clip our threads. And here, backwards, there we go. We can see that our square has been sewn nice and evenly with our red thread. You want to make sure that you are cleaning up your project as you go. So you can go ahead and snip your top threads and your bobbin threads. If you do it as you go, you will save yourself a lot of angst as you work your way through the project. There's nothing worse than trying to clip threads at the end of a project. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to run through our squiggle here. And we're going to do that the same exact way that we did the square. We're going to drop our presser foot. We're going to drop our needle down into the fabric. We're going to lock our stitches by going forward just a little bit and then going backwards. And now we're going to very, very gently guide our fabric through the squiggle. And so when you get into kind of a tight situation with these curves and you don't feel like you can manipulate the fabric any more than you've already manipulated it, it's just too tight of a curve, it's too tight of a circle, you can do that same trick that we did with our corners here. So here, this curve feels a little tight, so I've just dropped that needle into place. I'm going to raise the presser foot, move the fabric just a scooch, and then drop the presser foot.
We have a question.
Yeah.
Sarah asked, the name for trimming a project is called service in fashion design. Is it the same for costume?
I don't know. I have never heard that term before, service. So when you're trimming and cleaning up your threads or your garment, that's called service in fashion design. Okay, I have learned something new today, so thank you, Dara.
We've been servicing.
We've been servicing, that's very exciting. And so here you can see we are just running through that curve, trying to keep that center line engaged on our stitch line as much as possible. And we're just guiding that fabric through. And we're gonna lock our stitches at the end, raise that needle, raise that presser foot. And we are going to service our project by clipping our threads here. That's super exciting.
That is exciting. I'm excited. I like learning that.
Right?
Yep. Keep it coming, Dare.
I know, right? So there we go. So this is our square and our squiggle. If you're just starting out with machine sewing, I really recommend that you do a couple of little samplers here just to get the feel of how the fabric wants to move its way through your particular machine. All right. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to sew a standard seam. So I have prepared our fabric here for our standard seam. And so this, this is just kind of a regular printed quilter's cotton. This is really great fabric to learn on.
Fall theme too, Laura.
Sorry?
Fall theme too.
Yes, fall themed, yes. And so when you're working with these quilter's cottons, you can see that one side is going to be bright. We call that the right side of the fabric. And if you flip it over, the unprinted side still has the shadow of that printing, but it looks really, really dull. And that's the wrong side. So we've got right side is nice and bright, wrong side is dull. And so here I have traced our seam allowance. I've traced our stitch line on the edge of this fabric. And what we're going to do to put these two pieces of fabric together, we're going to make ourselves a little fabric sandwich. And we're going to line up these stitch lines. So we've got our right sides are going to be facing each other towards the inside of the sandwich. And then our wrong sides are going to be on the outside of the sandwich. And we want to line up our stitch lines. And if we line up those stitch lines nice and evenly, we're going to get a really, really accurate sew. And so we're going to pin these two pieces of fabric together before we run them through the machine. And there are two really common ways of pinning. I feel very strongly about how to pin fabric together. So if you learned some sewing techniques at home, if you learned from a parent or a grandparent or a family member, you may have seen them pin so that the pins live perpendicular to the edge of the fabric where you're sewing. And this is really, really common amongst home sewers. I think this is an older technique. And what people end up doing is they will pin perpendicular, and then they will run over the pins with the sewing machine and then pull them all out at once at the end of their seam or at the end of their project. I do not recommend that people do this. That is like the one hard and fast rule that I have. It's a big safety thing in here, because what happens is that 9 times out of 10, you're running down that seam and the needle is going to go right over that pin and it's going to be just fine. But that 1 out of 10 times, the needle is going to hit that pin dead on, straight on exactly. Yeah, Adrian's making faces. And when the needle hits that pin straight on exactly, you've got two pieces of metal hitting each other. The needle is either going to bend or it is going to break. And then the needle may fall, the point of the needle may fall into the machine and it could damage the machine. If the needle bends and you don't realize it, as it drops down into that bobbin casing, you could damage the bobbin mechanism because the needle is out of alignment. Or the worst thing that could happen is that the point of the needle or the point of the pin could fly back into your face and injure your face. You could get a needle in the eye. It could cause some serious injury or serious damage to your machine. So we do not recommend this method of pinning. We don't recommend this perpendicular method of pinning. We definitely do not recommend running the sewing machine over pins. It is legit dangerous. So please, friends, don't do it. I don't want to have to take you to the ER. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these pins out, and we are going to pin parallel.
Paula says, that happened to me and it flew like a boomerang, but I didn't get hurt luckily.
Yeah, see, thank you for sharing that experience. I'm so glad that you weren't hurt, but it can be really, really dangerous, like for reals, y'all. So learn from our experiences of not sewing over your fingers and not sewing over your pins. Let's just not sew over anything but fabric. How's that? And so here, we're going to pin parallel to our seam here. And we're going to match up our stitch lines. And that's going to give us a really, really accurate sew as we move through. And the other thing I really like about this parallel pinning is that it's actually engaging more of the fabric. So your fabric stays together a little more sturdily. You have less slippage, especially if you're working with really, really slinky fabrics, or if you're working with things like velvet, velveteen, satins, anything that has a little bit of a sheen or a little bit of a slip to it. Doing this parallel pinning is just going to make your life a heck of a lot easier. All right, so now that we have our seam completely pinned, now we're going to run this through the machine. And we're going to do that just like we did our little square and squiggle sampler here. We're going to pull our tails of our bobbin and our top thread out. And we are going to drop our presser foot. We're going to line up that center line of our presser foot and drop our needle in place. And now you can see this first pin is really, really close to our presser foot. So I'm just going to pull that one out right away before I even start. And now I'm going to lock my stitches. So I'm going to go forward just a scooch, go backwards just a scooch, and now I'm ready to sew. And here you can see we are sewing along that line. And when we get to the point where we're approaching our next pin, we can just pull that pin out. You want to position the pins so that when you run it through the machine, the heads of the pins are facing you. So you can just pull that right out and keep on going. And honestly, with practice, you don't even have to pause very much as you move forward. And we're going to pull that out, get to the end, and we're going to lock our stitches in place by going backwards and forwards. Fully engage that needle up at the top and pull out our project, snippy snip our threads. And so now we have a nice, clean, standard seam. And so here we can see this is the wrong side of our fabric. If we open that up, we've got our seam allowance here in the center. And if we look at the right side of the fabric, we have what it would look like on the outside. The last thing that you need to do before we can call this a completed project is that we need to press this seam, because I don't know if you can see it right now, but this seam just looks kind of lumpy and bumpy. It does not look clean. It does not look finished. If we laid this flat, it's not going to lie very flat. So to get a really professional look, a professional finish to your garments, you're going to want to press your seams. So I'm going to walk over to our little ironing board here, and to prep our press, what we're going to do is we're going to lay our project so that the right side is facing down and our seam allowance is up on the top. We're going to very gently open up that seam allowance and just kind of press that down into place. And that's going to open that up so that we can press it very, very cleanly. Sometimes when we are pressing our projects, you may want to use what we call a press cloth. So you can lay a piece of fabric, a cotton fabric, on top of your more delicate fabrics, just to make sure that you're not going to burn your project or you're not going to damage your more expensive fabric. For things like cottons and linens, you can press directly on it. For fabrics, polyesters, especially polyesters, tend to melt and they tend to burn. Anything that's going to be a little more delicate, you can lay a piece of fabric on top of that. All right, so now, let's see if our iron is woken up enough. We are just going to very carefully press that open. And then for cottons and for linens, fabric that I like to press very, very well. I like to do it on the right side of the fabric too, if I can, just to get a really, really nice, clean finish. And you can see suddenly that's opening up our seam really, really nicely. There's no folds, there's no bumps here. We have a nice, clean, even press on both sides. So that is going to be our standard seam. Again, that's going to be like 90% of the seams that we do here in the costume shop. All right, we're going to go back to the sewing machine. We're going to do a couple of fancier seams. One of the seams that we like to do is if you need something to be really, really strong and really, really sturdy, you can do what is called a flat felled seam. That's F-L-A-T, F-E-L-L-E-D, seam. And you see this a lot on jeans. If you look on the side of your jeans, if they're not cheap jeans like mine that have an unfinished edge on the inside. But if you look on nicer jeans that kind of those overlapping seams, that is a flat felled seam. Seams on the inside of a tent, on the inside of backpacks, anything that's going to need a lot of strength, you can use this seam for. And so we're going to start out by, just like we would our standard seam. So we're going to pin in place. We've got our fabric sandwich. with our right sides together, our wrong sides on the outside. And we're going to start out by doing just a regular standard seam. Do that. All right. So once we have our standard seam sewn, the next step is going to be to open up your project. We're going to be working with the seam allowance here, and we're going to choose one side of this seam allowance, and we're going to cut that seam allowance in half to maybe even a little more than half. So this is kind of the scary part, and it's okay. We're going to cut that seam allowance. Because what we're going to do is we're going to completely enclose our seam allowance here, and we're going to run another line of stitching on top of this. So now that we have one wide seam allowance and one narrow seam allowance, now we're going to go back over to the ironing board. You do get a lot of steps in, y'all, when you sew, because you're constantly going back and forth between the machine and the ironing board. And so we're going to press this into place. Flip it over. You want to make sure that you're getting a nice clean press. You want to make sure that you don't have any weird folds or bumps on the right side of the fabric or the wrong side of the fabric. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to take that wide seam allowance and we're going to fold it in on itself. So you can see here we've got narrow seam allowance, wide seam allowance, and we're going to fold that in on itself, and we're going to iron that fold into place. Very, very carefully. Don't want to burn your fingers. And then we're going to flip it over so that it completely covers that narrow seam allowance that we just cut. So you can see we've got our little fold here that's going to be protecting that edge. And if we flip it over and iron that into place, that's going to completely encase that seam allowance, and that's going to protect the edge of the fabric. And once we sew this into place, it's going to be double stitched and it's going to be really, really sturdy. So you can see we've got that folded over edge right there. Now we're going to go back over to the sewing machine. And since we have pressed this really, really closely, you can pin this into place if you feel like you need a little more security for these sturdier cottons that hold their press really well. I personally don't feel the need to do that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to line that center line of our presser foot just on the scant inside, maybe like 1/8 of an inch, maybe like 1/16 of an inch, like really, really close to the edge of that fold. And that's going to stitch down the seam allowance, and that's going to give us that double stitched seam that is going to be really, really sturdy. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to lock our stitches in place. We're going to go forwards, backwards.
Judy Morgan Davis says, how do you adjust your seam allowance when you are cutting the pattern piece if you are intending a flat felled seam?
If I was doing a flat felled seam on a standard pattern, you can just use the regular seam allowance. And so you would do that, you would cut it out with your regular 5/8 or 1/2 inch is probably a little narrow to do a flat felled seam. You probably want a wider seam allowance than that, but you can do it with the 5/8. You can do it, this is a 5/8 That was the seam allowance that I cut on that. And so you would do the same thing. You would do that standard seam first, and then you would go back and you would cut the seam allowance so that you have that narrow seam allowance that you can fold over. So I think the only thing that you would need to do is just make sure that your seam allowance is wide enough, and add in a little extra if like ½ an inch really feels a little narrow, unless you're feeling super, super tricksy fancy. But 5/8 of an inch is typically enough. And so here we can see we've got our double stitches on the back side. We've got that completely encased seam allowance there. And on the front side, we've got our standard seam is here. Those stitches are hidden, but our second line of stitches, that's going to be visible. So again, you're going to want to choose a thread that either is purposefully contrasting or a thread that's going to blend in that you don't want to see. So if that's important to you, make sure that we choose matching thread. All right, so that is our flat felled seam. The next fancy seam that we're going to do is we are going to do a French seam. And we use a French seam when we are, typically when we're working with very delicate fabrics or sheer fabrics especially. So if you're working with a very sheer silk, a chiffon, something that you're going to see the seam on the underside of the garment when you're actually wearing the garment. So you see this a lot in vintage sewing, where we do use a lot of sheer fabrics for those layered looks. And you also see it a lot in lingerie sewing. So if you're sewing undergarments where you're using kind of slinkier, more delicate fabrics, a French seam is going to be a really popular seam for that. And the reason why we use it is it's completely enclosed. It's pretty, so if you see the seam, it looks attractive, but it's going to act much like the flat felled seam, where it's going to completely enclose that raw edge of the fabric so that it is protecting that raw edge from the wear that you get when you're wearing something. And so this is going to protect that, and it's going to lengthen the life of your garment. And so for our French seam, we're going to start off with our fabric sandwich like we did for the standard seam and for the flat felled seam, but we're going to start our fabric sandwich a little differently. So with our standard seam, we always make our fabric sandwich so our right sides are together and our wrong sides are facing out. For the French seam, we're going to reverse that. So we are going to start with our fabric sandwich so that the right sides are on the outside. I know, mind blown. Right sides are on the outside, wrong sides are on the inside. And we're just going to line up those cut edges and pin that into place real quick. And so for this, we want the first run, the first seam that we sew, to be pretty close to that cut edge. So typically what I'm going to do is make sure that my needle is centered on our presser foot. And if you line up the right edge of your presser foot with that cut edge of the fabric, that's typically going to give you enough clearance so that when we flip this around to run our second seam, everything will be completely enclosed. So I'm going to run this through. I'm going to line up that edge of the presser foot there. Drop our needle in, and lock and go. I'm going to lock at the end. And trim. From here, we're going to go back over to the ironing board. And we are going to press it just like we did with our standard seam. But instead of opening it up, like that. We're just going to choose one side and we're going to press it to one side or the other. So both halves of the seam allowance are going in the same direction. From there, I'm going to flip and just want to give your pieces of fabric just a little tug, just to make sure that we're getting as clean a press as possible. We don't want there to be any fold over. We don't want there to be any edge that's going to get in the way here. So we're going to press that on this side as well. And so now when we're working on the back side of our fabric, we're going to fold our two pieces together so that the edge of that seam is right there on the edge of our project. And we're going to give that one more press. And now we can go back over to the sewing machine and pin this in place. And so here you can see where I have drawn in my stitch lines. So I'm just going to make sure that those match up on either side. And I'm going to pin that in place. And so the trick with the French seam is that, much like with the flat felled seam, you want to make sure that your seam allowance is completely enclosed and completely covered. So as you're pinning for this second run, you can sometimes kind of feel with your fingers where that seam allowance is. You just want to make sure that that is fully enclosed. And then you can also just double check yourself by opening it up. And if there's any kind of raw edge peeking out, you can go ahead and trim that down so that it is completely enclosed. We look pretty good here. So we're going to run this through the machine one more time. So now our fabric sandwich is set. So our right sides are facing in, our wrong sides are facing out. We're going to run that through. Snip your threads. So now we can see, if we look on the back side or the wrong side of the project, we've got our little flap. And on the right side of the project, it looks just like a standard seam, but our seam allowance is completely encased. So the last thing that we do is we're going to give this one more press. I promise y'all, you get your steps in doing this. And you just choose a side and press that seam allowance to either the left or the right. And give it one more good press on the front as well. And so that is going to be our French seam. So you can see on the front side, it looks just like our standard seam. But on the back side, that seam allowance is completely enclosed in this little flap. So you can imagine if this was done in a sheer fabric or silky fabric, where you could actually see this little flap through your garment. This is going to be a very clean, a very enclosed seam that's going to look very, very attractive and still be really, really sturdy. So French seams are really super useful. I love them. All right, so the last thing that I want to go over with y'all is gathering. And so gathering is going to be when we are taking a very, very long piece of fabric. There we go, very big piece of fabric. And we want to squish it down so that it fits into a small piece of fabric. And so we use gathering quite a bit if you're making things like skirts, if you're making dresses, any sort of decorative sort of scrunching of the fabric, you're going to use gathering for that. So since we do tend to do a lot of oldie-timey shows here at NC State, most of the skirts that we put on stage are going to have some sort of a gathered element to them. The other way that you can kind of squish the fabric down is going to be pleating the fabric. And so the difference between gathering and pleating is gathering is going to be pulling on threads that are sewn into the fabric so that you get kind of a ruched or kind of a squished effect. And pleating is going to be actually folding the fabric flat. So it's less squishy, it's less poofy. Your pleats are going to lay nice and flat like this. And we're going to go over a couple of different pleating methods when we get to our historic sewing techniques. But gathering tends to be a really, really common technique that you use for most 20th century earlier and later garments. And so to prep our fabric or prep our project for gathering, we're going to pretend that this is our skirt piece. This is the actual skirt bit. And we're going to pretend that this is our waistband bit. So this is going to be what's going to go around the waist. This is going to be our nice fluffy skirt. So on the wrong side of the fabric, I have drawn my stitch line. So I've got my 5/8 inch seam allowance from the cut edge here down to our stitch line. And what we're going to do is we're going to run 2 rows of stitches, one above this line and one below this line. The reason why I like to do 2 rows of gathering stitches is that it gives you a lot more control over how the gathers present or how the gathers are put onto the waistband or onto the garment. You see in a lot of sewing manuals, you see in a lot of books, just one line of Adrian's making faces at me again. One line of gathering stitches here. And when you only have that one line, you can gather. It is technically gathered, but your gathers tend to be uneven. They tend to be bunchy. They tend to just not look as clean and polished as the effect that you get when you run 2 gathering lines. So we're going to do that here. So what we're going to do is we're going to line up that edge of our presser foot with this line on either side, and we're going to move our stitch length all the way down to 5. So we want our gathering stitches to be the widest stitch length possible that you have on your machine. On our Berninas here, it's going to be all the way down to 5. And then we're going to choose one side or the other of our stitch line here. I'm going to start with my presser foot, the left side of my presser foot lined up with our gathering line or with our stitch line there. We're going to drop our needle in. And so we are going to lock our stitches at the beginning, but we're going to not lock. We're going to leave them open here at the end. So we only want to lock our stitches on one side of our project here. And you want to make sure that you're locking on the same start. I usually lock when I start and leave the end unlocked just so I don't get confused. So we're going to lock, we're going to go forward, back, forward, and we're going to go all the way. End. And we are not locking. I'm not going forwards and backwards. I'm just pulling that out. I'm leaving myself a nice long tail that I can grab onto, and I'm going to snip that. And so now I'm going to do the same thing. I go ahead and snip threads at the beginning. I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side of our little stitch line. So we're going to lock and go. And not locking. So we're going to pull that out. We're going to leave ourselves a nice long tail. So now you can see we have 2 rows of red stitches here with our black stitch line in between them. So that is exactly where we want to be. All right, so I'm gonna snip our tails at the top here. And so the trick with gathering is that so what you want to do is you want to grab the top threads. So we're going to grab these 2 threads on top of that wrong side of the fabric, and we're just going to let the threads, the bobbin threads on the right side of the fabric, we're just going to let those hang there. We're not going to pay any attention to those. We're going to hold on to these top threads, and I usually kind of wrap them around my finger just to give myself a little tension. And we're not going to pull the thread. So if you pull the thread, you're likely to snap your gathering stitches, and then you're going to say a lot of curse words because you have to take it all out and do it all over again. So we're not going to pull the thread. What we're going to do is we're going to just kind of hold it so that it's nice and taut. We're going to give ourselves a little bit of tension there. Instead, we're going to put my thumb and my first finger there in between those 2 rows. There we go. In between those 2 rows of gathering stitches. And we're going to move the fabric down the threads. And so you can see how we're already getting that nice, clean, look how clean and even those gathering stitches look because we've got these 2 threads that we're working with. So we're just going to pull that all the way down. I have never done this at this angle before, so y'all will have to forgive me here. Sewing for the camera is a lot harder than sewing just for yourself. But you can see how by just giving yourself a little tension there, you pick up that slack as you work your way down, and then holding on to that fabric in between those 2 rows of threads, we're able to very, very easily move that fabric down and get this really, really lovely gathered ruffle here. And so when you have it down to about what you think your waistband needs to be, I usually eyeball it. You can measure it and get it exact, but I like to kind of eyeball it to about where it's supposed to be and then actually attach it to the waistband using pins and just move those gathers through the waistband to make sure that it is even and it's exactly where I want it to be. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to make our fabric sandwich again. We make so many sandwiches, y'all. I don't get to eat lunch until like 3 o'clock on Tuesdays, so I'm starving. So we're going to make ourselves a little fabric sandwich here. And so to attach the skirt, our little ruffle bit, to our waistband, we've got waistband, we've got ruffle, and we're going to attach those right side to right side, and we're going to be working with the ruffle side up. And the reason that's important is that lets us access these gathers and these ruffles as we run it through the machine so that we can control exactly what's happening here. And if we can kind of even these out, and if we can make sure that they're standing up nice and tall and straight as we run it through the machine, we're going to get a much prettier gather. And so typically what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up my cut edge or my edges there, and I'm going to work from the locked side over to the unlocked side. And that's going to let me open up these gathers nice and evenly as I position them across the waistband.
We have a question.
Yeah.
What brand of threads would you recommend using?
Oh, personally, I like the Gutermann threads. Their all-purpose polyester thread is just a really, really good standard thread. It's nice and smooth. It works really well with most sewing machines. The Coats and Clark is also fine. I think that personally I find the Gutermann a little easier to work with. I think it's a little smoother, but the Coats and Clark stuff is fine. You want to make sure that if you're doing it with if you're using it for machine sewing, you want to make sure that you're getting a thread that's appropriate for your fabric. So most times the all-purpose, the polyester thread is going to be just fine. Some machines will take specialty threads like a heavier weight, like a jean thread or an upholstery thread. Some machines will take a silk thread. Gutermann has a very lovely silk thread that I like to use for hand sewing, but some machines will take it. You just want to make sure that you're using the proper needle size. So the thicker your thread is, the larger needle you're going to need. But for most projects, that all-purpose polyester thread is going to be just fine, and I like the Gutermanns, but you know, you do you. All right, so we've got our fabric sandwich. We've got our stitch lines here, so we're going to match up our stitch lines, and we're going to pin from the front here. Just make sure those are lined up as best we can. Again, this angle is weird, y'all. All right, and so you can see I've gathered that way down. That's going to be a lot shorter than our little waistband here. So, but because I started pinning over here where I've locked, I can just go ahead and very gently open that up so that we get a nice even gather going across our project. There are ratios. There's some math that you can do to figure out what ratio of skirt to waistband you want to get the level of ruffle that you want. Basically, the more skirt that you have, the tighter your ruffles, the tighter your gathers are going to be. This is about at a 1-to-2 ratio, so it's a pretty loose gather. If I'm doing period things, I tend to like a much tighter gather. So you can see we've got that basically pretty evenly spread out there. So now we're going to go back in and we're going to pin that in place. And we can just zhuzh that. We can move that gather around so it looks nice and even across this little waistband here. And once we have that pin in place, you want to make sure that you are moving your stitch length back to our standard medium range. Back on the Bernina's, it's at a 2.5. So you want to make sure that you are not sewing with that really, really wide stitch. So we're back at the 2.5, and now we're just going to run our sewing machine down that stitch line, down the center of these two gathering threads. And here we're going to go back to our, making sure we're locking in place at the front and at the end of our seam. And here, I don't know if you can see this, but you can see how as we run it through the machine, I can kind of give the fabric a little bit of a tug on either side, and that's going to position those gathers so that they are nice and perpendicular to our edge. That's going to give us a much prettier gather, a much more even looking gather. The end there. All right. So now we have our little waistband. It is attached to our skirt like so. So the next thing we want to do is we want to remove this row of gathering stitches that is visible from the front. So we have a row that is a row of gathering stitches that can be caught up on the inside of the waistband here. We don't have to remove those. We can just let those live there. But this bottom row underneath our stitch line, that would be visible from the outside of our project. So we want that to go away. And so for that, all we're going to do is you can use a seam ripper or you can use your scissors. We're just going to snip our thread there. And you can very carefully pull that gathering thread, and you should be able to just pull it out like so. That pulls out nice and easy because we use those big wide stitches. Pull out the bottom thread from the front. And then just clean up where you locked your stitches there. All right, so now, glasses back on. Now we are, there we go. Now we are ready to press. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and snip off any remaining tails here. That is kind of that's the thing about gathering, is that you do end up with a lot of waste thread floating around. All right, so now what we need to do is we need to make this an actual waistband. We need to make it look like the top of a skirt. So we want to make sure that all of this gathering mess, all of this raw edge, this is going to be completely enclosed in our waistband. And so there are a couple of different ways that you can do this. You can fold that over and you can do a hand stitch on the inside using either the whip stitch or the cross stitch. But I'm lazy, so I do a method called stitch in the ditch. And this is a method that we can do on the machine. It's super fast, it's super sturdy, and it's going to be really, really quick because we got 9 minutes. So we're going to go over to the ironing board. And first thing we need to do is we need to press all of this. We want to tug on our little waistband and tug on our gathered bit like so. And when we press this, we don't want to press this fluffy bit. If we press this fluffy bit, it's not going to be fluffy anymore. It's going to be flat. So we want to press our seam allowance just on that waistband side. And then we can flip it over and just double check that. Give it a little tug, make sure it looks nice and even, and give it another press there. All right, and so the next thing we want to do is we want to we have our seam allowance here marked. We want to go ahead and just fold the fabric in on that seam allowance. If you do this enough, you learn how to eyeball it. You can go back and you can measure with your seam gauge to double check yourself. And we're going to go ahead and press that fold into place like that. So now you can see we've got our gathered bit, our little skirt bit, that seam allowance is pressed up, and then the edge of our waistband, our internal waistband, is pressed down. So now we're going to go ahead and fold this over and we're going to stitch all of this together. So we're going to take our waistband, fold it over on the, there we go, there we go. Fold it over on the inside so that it's completely covering up that stitch line. And now we're going to flip it over and we're going to pin from the right side. And so the trick is to make sure that that folded over edge is just to the side of our stitch line. And then if we pin right on top of that gathered bit, right underneath that, that waistband bit, so we're going to sew in that little ditch right here. That's why that's called stitch in the ditch. We're sewing right in between those two. If we pin appropriately, we're going to pin right underneath, and we're going to catch the back of that waistband right there. And as long as we pin this so that we're catching the back of that waistband, and we stitch right underneath that waistband, if we stitch right in that ditch, we're going to completely enclose this waistband into place with one very, very quick seam. That's going to be really, really sturdy. And when it's done with matching colored thread, it is legit downright invisible. Like, you cannot see it at all. So for period pieces, for stage, it works just fine. It looks just as nice as a hand done waistband, but it takes half the time and it is really, really sturdy. All right, so you can see I've got it pinned from the front there because this is the part that's visible, so we want the most control over that. On the back, I've caught that edge of the waistband going all the way across. So now I'm going to go ahead and stitch this into place. So we're going to line that center line of our presser foot right in that little ditch there, and we're going to sew this down. And if we've done it right, that will completely enclose this waistband. Make sure you're locking at the front and at the back. Snippy snip. So if we look at the back, our waistband is completely closed. And if we look at the front, that red line is mostly in that little ditch here. And you can imagine that if that was done in a matching tan or a matching brown thread, that would be close to invisible. All right, so that is all the time that we have today. So we've gone over how to use a sewing machine, how to thread it, how to do some basic practice stitching. We went over our standard seam, our flat felled seam, and our French seam, and how to gather and make yourself a tiny little cat apron. So thank you so much for joining us, and have an awesome week.